Overhead squat flexibility issues. What are common overhead squat flexibility issues? How to spot overhead squat flexibility issues, and how to analyze and, even more important, interpret overhead squat flexibility issues. So what are common overhead squat flexibility issues? As I've mentioned before in previous videos, the overhead squat is a real head-to-toe exercise, or even wrist-to-toe exercise. So everything between the bar and the ground has to work. So if we look at it from the bottom up, it's ankle, knees, hip, lower back, thoracic spine, shoulders, wrist and elbows to a certain extent. So now we need to figure out which is the flexibility issue that limits our ability to overhead squat correctly or overhead squat more weight. So let's have a look at that. If we look at all the segments involved in the movement of the overhead squat, the ankle. So if ankle mobility is limited, what we see is the athlete can't achieve full depth, or if he achieves full depth, the heels are coming off. If we look at the next segment, the knees, we can see the varus or the valgus, which is just complicated words for knees coming in and knees going out. So the knees need to be aligned. You don't want to get them anywhere in or anywhere out. If we look at the hip, with the hip there can be multiple issues. It can be a hip shift left or right. It can also be that the flexibility in the hip is not sufficient enough to allow for enough squat depth. So that's something to be looked at and needs to be figured out. The lower back and the hips are pretty much connected. The lower back, what we see very often is the butt wing. So the lower the athlete goes, we see that the hip posteriorly tilts. Posterior tilt is referred to rounding forward. So the lower back and the hip rounds and gets a little bit under the bar. The thoracic spine, also very common for a lot of people that sit a lot in front of the computer or sit on their mobiles nowadays. So the thoracic spine is not flexible enough, so we see the upper back, the thoracic spine rounding. Again, the thoracic spine and the shoulders very much connected. If there's not enough flexibility in the shoulder, we can see that the shoulder and the bar goes a little bit in front of the body. So that is an issue with the shoulder. With the elbows, again, elbows and wrist are not that often. You don't see a lot of problems in the wrist or elbows, but it can still happen. So elbows, the arms cannot extend fully. It needs to be, that is very important actually, that the arm is fully extended and locked, because if you get to some point where you're lifting heavier and heavier and serious weights, the arms are not are not strong enough to support the weight. So you need to be able to lock it, and then the lower body is doing the heavy lifting in the purest sense of the word of the overhead squat. The wrist flexibility is important. So we see a lot of weird positions in the wrist, but even more than that, what you see is that athletes experience some pain in the wrist if they do overhead squats. So this is also an overhead squat flexibility issue of the wrist. So important here is for the overhead squat flexibility, where we see the problem is not always where the problem lies. So what do I mean with that? Just let me explain that with a simple example. If we see that so-called butt wing, so the hip is tilting forward and the lower back is rounding, most often we think it's the hip or the lower back, but very often it can also be the ankle. So we see that ankle flexibility is not enough. Therefore, we see a compensation in the joint of the lower back and the hip. So to wrap it up, what are common overhead squat flexibility issues? If we look at ankle, knee, hip, lower back, thoracic spine, shoulder, elbows and wrist. And most important, where we see the problem is not always where the problem lies. So we need to have a little bit of a closer look to what is cause and what is reaction.